Good evening to everyone on the East Coast, and good afternoon to our friends on the West Coast. My name is Bryan Leib, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, and I will be the moderator for this evening's webinar. So thank you for joining us for this special conversation with Israel's Consul General to the Pacific Southwest, Dr. Hillel Newman. For this webinar, IAL has partnered with the oldest pro-Israel organization in America, the Zionist Organization of America. And shortly we will hear opening remarks from ZOA's national president, Mr. Morton A. Klein. And this is not the first, and I hope it's not the last time that our organizations partner together. And I want to share with the audience that earlier this year, we, ZOA and on IAL, launched a co-branded campaign that we called No Nuclear Holocaust. And it was to raise awareness about what the Iranian regime would do if they were ever to obtain a nuclear bomb. And it was a call to action for the American people, Jews and non-Jews, to raise their voices to say no to a nuclear Iran. So I encourage you to visit www.nonuclearholocaust.com to learn a little bit more about this campaign. So the topic of tonight's webinar is relations between Israel, Iran, and the Arab/Muslim world, past, present, and future. And throughout this webinar, we will shine a spotlight on the long-standing relations between the freedom-loving Iranian people and the freedom-loving Israeli people, while also speaking about the regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran and their continued aggression towards the world's only Jewish state, the state of Israel. Now, what I'm most excited to discuss with the Consul General tonight is the future, but we'll get to that a little bit later in our conversation tonight. And as many of you know, in September of 2021, we're coming up on the anniversary. On the White House lawn, the United States of America brokered the Abraham Accords, which were normalization agreements between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. The Abraham Accords have, in my opinion, really ushered in a new era of peace and stability in the region, while also increasing diplomatic and economic ties between Israel and their Arab neighbors. So it's a very exciting time for all of us right now. But before we get started with this program, I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Morton Klein, to provide some opening remarks. And the audience should know that Mort has been a stalwart supporter of the state of Israel and of the Jewish people for the last 30 plus years. In addition, Mort and the ZOA will continue to keep up the fight, to do everything they can to make sure that they advocate against a non-nuclear Iran, while also warning of the danger of the United States of America re-entering the catastrophic JCPOA. So thank you, Mort, for everything that you do and everything that you will continue to do. At this point, the floor is yours, Mort, if you could please provide some opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan, and thank you for partnering with ZOA in exposing the truth of what Iran is doing and wants to do to Israel and to the Western world, to the entire world. It's not only Israel. I thought I'd open with just to talk up very, very briefly about ZOA. I'll be lecturing in Los Angeles at the Sephardic Synagogue on September 4th. I'll be making a major lecture at a major conservative conference in Dallas, September 13th, on anti-Semitism. I'll be giving a major speech at the Gross Holocaust Center in Miami in early December on the truth about Jerusalem. Whose city is it? I'll be giving a speech in January at the International Conference in Zurich with world leaders in political science and economics. And I'll be speaking on the Arab-Islamic war against Israel. ZOA's dinner, gala dinner, is going to be in New York City, December 19th. We'll have a superstar cast, as we always do. And tomorrow, by the way, at 11:10 a.m., I'll be on Newsmax TV discussing the surge in anti-Semitism and my least favorite ice cream, Ben & Jerry's. We should all realize that Iran leaders have repeatedly, and the media there have repeatedly proclaimed death to the Jews, death to Israel. They even put this message on their missiles. And as Elie Wiesel said, one thing we Jews learned from the Holocaust is if a group or a country says they want to kill you, believe them, take it seriously. We are taking and must take Iran very seriously, just like we have to take the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah very seriously, because they call for Israel's destruction repeatedly. And even, I might add, in a more minor but important role, Black Lives Matter, the group, the organization. 2 weeks ago, its major leaders said, our goal is Israel's end. Unbelievable. I wonder if these horrifying attacks by Muslims in the Arab world and Blacks in Black Lives Matter is a factor in why almost every attack against Jews in America, physical attack, has been either a Muslim or a Black. That is a painful fact that I'm simply need to report. It is deeply troubling that the Biden administration wants to re-enter the Obama-Iran deal that Trump ended. Obama's deal gave Iran over $100 billion. And since Iran is the biggest funder of Islamic terrorism in the world, including funding Hamas and Hezbollah, this has only helped increase Islamic terrorism. Hamas has publicly thanked Iran for their funds, for their missiles, and for teaching Hamas how to build their own missiles. Without Iran, Hamas wouldn't have been able to launch these wars against Israel. Hezbollah wouldn't be able to launch their missiles against the Israeli Jews. Biden has already rescinded many of the sanctions that were put in place under Donald Trump, and the ones he hasn't rescinded, he's ignoring. So he's already made enormous concessions to Iran, even though there's no deal of any sort in place. This is despite the fact that Biden repeatedly stated that he will never rescind the sanctions in order to induce Iran to get back into the deal, but he did it anyway. But despite Biden negotiating with Iran, they're now enriching uranium to 63%. The deal only allows them to enrich it to 3.7%. You needed to enrich it to 90% in order to get nukes. They're very close. Trump's pressure by ending the deal reduced Iran's military expenditures and reduced their ability to fund terrorists. We reduced terrorist attacks all over the world when Obama left the plan. And they're also, by the way, Iran is arming Syria as well. And Iranians in Syria are attacking US personnel in Syria. Syria is now building their own missiles with Iranian help. And on July 13th, 4 Iranians here in America tried to kidnap an American human rights activist, a human rights activist against the Iranian terrorist regime. They were arrested. And when Biden was asked about this, how can you continue negotiating with Iran when they just attempted to kidnap an American citizen? He said, this has nothing to do with our negotiations. Can you believe it? He said, this has nothing to do when 4 Iranians were trying to kidnap an American citizen. Iran helped plan 9/11. People don't realize that. They work with Al-Qaeda. Iran is an evil regime, evil. And the deal, by the way, even if they go back in the deal, by 2030, there's sunset clauses, meaning by 2030, all restrictions are off. They can immediately work toward a nuclear weapon. This very morning, we had a conference call with Dennis Ross and Danielle Pletka. I asked Dennis Ross about this. I said, why are they so anxious to get into a deal that in 8 years, legally they can develop nuclear weapons? Dennis Ross said to me and those on the call, but at least we have 8 years where they can't do anything. That was his answer. And Danielle Pletka responded, well, I don't think that'll matter. She doesn't trust them. They're going to be working on getting a nuclear weapon during these 8 years, even though they're not supposed to, if they reinstitute the deal. But I believe that Israel is taking Elie Wiesel's warning very seriously. They're preparing for all sorts of actions, including military, to ensure that Iran dare not develop nuclear weapons, which is a threat not only to Israel, but to Europe, the Western world, and the United States, because they're also developing intercontinental missiles, which can reach the United States of America. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mort, very much for those opening remarks. And again, thank you for everything that you've been doing throughout your career and what you, I'm sure, will continue to do as well. So at this time, it's my distinct pleasure and an absolute honor to introduce our special guest, Israel's Consul General to the Pacific Southwest, Dr. Hillel Newman. Before I turn the floor over to the Consul General, I'm going to read a very short bio about him so you can get to know a little bit more about his background. The Consul General assumed this post in July of 2019, and he serves as the senior representative of the State of Israel to the Pacific Southwest. Consul General Newman is a highly respected author, academic, and statesman. His diplomatic experience includes serving as a policy advisor to 3 foreign ministers, ambassador to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and deputy consul general in Boston here in the United States. The consul general made Aliyah in Israel with his family and as a young man from South Africa, and he served as a medic in the IDF, and he's married to Ayala. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the couple have a 10-year-old son. So again, Dr. Newman, it's an honor and pleasure to be able to have you with us tonight. And I'd like to give you the floor for some brief opening remarks before we jump into the topic of tonight's event.
Thank you, Brian. It is my honor and my pleasure to share this platform with such distinguished people as yourself, Bryan Leib and Morton Klein from ZOA. It is really my pleasure. Well, we've got so much we can talk about in the aspect of Iran, but I'll just say a few brief opening remarks. One is that, you know, Israel, from its inception, from its beginning, before 1948 and after its establishment in 1948, extended its hand in peace and friendship to the entire global community that included, of course, the Arab and Muslim world. Those that have accepted our hand have had peace with Israel. Unfortunately, the majority still decline and still even reject the existence of the State of Israel. We've seen some development. It began, of course, with Egypt and Jordan, and now we've seen with Abraham Accords. But still, if you look at the 22 states of the Arab League and the non-Arab states of the Muslim bloc, the majority do not even recognize the State of Israel. But in that aspect, Iran is one of the leaders of the anti-bloc, and the biggest problem for Israel in that bloc. And of course, I'm sure we'll talk about it. As we speak today now, there is an Iranian delegation in Israel. And it's paralleled so much the fact that we are here in our talk here in the US, we are building bridges with your wonderful organization of the Iranian Americans for Liberty. And as we speak, there is a delegation of Iranians, non-Jewish Iranians that are visiting Israel in a solidarity visit expressing support of Israel. And that shows how it's so important, the policy of Israel, of the distinction between the regime and the people. We make a very clear distinction. We understand where the regime is, but we also feel for the people of Iran who have been taken hostage by a malign, hostile regime that doesn't care for their interests in any way. In fact, does a lot to harm their own interests of their own people. So we take this into consideration. And as we speak now, also there's great plight in Iran, where there's a shortage of water and a shortage of basic commodities for the people. And this just shows how Iran has taken such a wrong choice and gone the wrong path, because Iran, as we knew it, used to be a wonderful power in the world. And look where it is now, where people, children on the streets, have to beg for water. And if only they would have a correct policy towards Israel and the Western world, then they would find themselves in a different situation completely. So we call for the benefit of the people of Iran that the Iranian regime change its policy entirely, totally, or fall away and call for a new policy, a new regime in Iran that can live in peace with Israel, will accept Israel's extended hand for peace, and then we will have peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Consul General, for making reference about what is happening inside Iran right now. If before we get into our questions, just to provide some brief commentary on that, it's truly remarkable how you and I and Mort and everyone on this call that's here in the U.S. When we go, to get a drink of water from the faucet, never once do we think, gee, maybe water might not come out today. And unfortunately, the people of Iran are facing that very issue. And not just that, they're also facing electricity shortages, blackouts, internet blackouts. And there's a lot of people that want to, shift this or mold this in that, this is a climate change issue and deflecting from the real issue. And the real issue is the mismanagement of this regime. And while they've been spending billions of dollars funding terrorism around the world, instead of taking care of their own people. So hopefully we'll get into that, but thank you very much. And I know the Iranian American community very much appreciates that comment. So let's jump into our first question. Let's talk about the past. So prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Iranian people, as we've talked about tonight, they enjoyed warm relations with the state of Israel and with their citizens, with your citizens. There were no travel restrictions between the countries, and many Iranians, Jews and non-Jews, would travel to Israel for medical procedures, to visit family, and to vacation. So can you please give our audience your perspective on the relations Israel had with Iran prior to the revolution in '79?
Sure. We see, there are many scholars who see 4 stages in the development of the relations between Israel and Iran. Where the first stage is what we call the period of ambivalence, which was more or less between 1947 till 1953, till the coup, which brought Pahlavi dynasty. Then we see the big change towards friendship and collaboration and cooperation, which occurred with the coup in 1953, and which continued until the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And that was an extended period of wonderful relations between Israel and Iran. The third period is after the revolution, what we call the immediate period after the revolution, 1979 till about 1990, where we had, of course, difficult relations, but they were not as hostile as they are today. And from 1990, more or less, until today, we're really in a hostile environment due to the actions and the decisions of the Iranian regime. May I just remind everyone that Iran was the second Muslim country to recognize Israel after Turkey. So that just shows how, if we go back in time, what a wonderful potential there is in the relationship. Israel always viewed Iran as a natural ally, being a non-Arab Muslim country. In the past, especially during the Cold War, the hostility was really between the Pan-Arabism bloc and between Israel. It wasn't seen as hostility between Islam and between Judaism, or there were many golden periods in relations between Islam and Judaism. So what is actually, Israel saw Iran as a natural ally. And during the Pahlavi dynasty, there were wonderful relations of cooperation and collaboration, which covered many fields, even the infrastructure of Iran. Solel Boneh, which is an Israeli company, built many of the most famous buildings and infrastructure in Iran. People don't even realize it, that much of the infrastructure that still exists in Tehran today was actually built by an Israeli company. And there was also wonderful activity in medical field and tourism. And as you said, there was no regime of visas and things like that. It was open tourism. It was wonderful relationship. And it changed overnight with the Islamic Revolution. The Israelis and even Jews found themselves under threat, life-threatening situation. In fact, there are a few movies about the situation overnight when the Islamic Revolution took place and how the Israelis got out of Tehran. I know there's a famous movie about the Americans, I think Argo, if I remember correctly, but there was also the story about the Israelis who overnight their life was in jeopardy due to the revolution. So historically, if we look back, we can also go back to Cyrus the Great, the Persian leader who was seen as a model of tolerance, who allowed the Jews to go back to the land of Israel and build the sovereignty of Israel in the land of Israel and even the temple. So we have a wonderful historical relationship with the Iranian people, and Iran culture is part of the rich diversity in Israel. And there's great admiration in Israel for the Iranian, Persian cuisine, culture, in every way, music. They've got prominent positions in the state of Israel. So there's a great admiration for the Persian culture and for the Iranian people. We understand this, the fact that there is skilled people with great motivation and diligence. So there's so much to do together. If only this malign regime would go or change its policy towards Israel. So I just say that there's tremendous potential if we go back to the historical relationship.
Yeah, and we'll build on that a little bit more when we talk about the future. But you certainly make some fantastic points about the past. Now let's switch to the present. As we all know, the regime that rules the Islamic Republic of Iran constantly chants "Death to America, death to Israel" on their city streets, in their government buildings. Regime supporters routinely burn the flags of these two countries. And the Ayatollah Khamenei uses his social media platforms to spew vile hatred against the Jewish people and the state of Israel. You know, it's widely known that the Islamic Republic of Iran are the main funders behind organizations, terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, who I should note are both on the US State Department's FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And, you know, Israel's leadership, to their credit, has repeatedly stated that they will do whatever is necessary to ensure that this evil regime never obtains a nuclear bomb. So can you please provide a little bit of commentary on current situation that between these two countries?
Sure. You rightfully noted that it's the regime is an enemy not only of Israel, but the United States. In fact, the great Satan, of course, is the United States. People focus a lot on the relations between Israel and Iran as if it's a conflict between Israel and Iran, but it's not. It's an ideological, religious conflict between the Western world and between the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And people should understand that the danger is to the Western world and the values that we uphold, the values that we believe in. That's the issue. It's not a territorial conflict or something like that. Now, the malign activity of Iran it's like an octopus. It's not only the nuclear issue, it covers hemispheres. It's the missile issue, it's terrorism. They're the number one sponsor of state sponsor of terrorism worldwide. It's the human rights issue. It's the export of the revolution and the unrest in the Middle East. They're trying to export the revolution and expand their influence, and they already have been successful in expanding from all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean by taking over influence in Iraq, in Syria, and other places. And they expand their revolution and cause conflict between themselves and the West, like we see in Yemen and Iraq and all the different places where there are ongoing military conflicts due to Iran. The crux of the issue with Israel is, of course, that Iran is not only just an ideology, but a practical vision of trying to annihilate the state of Israel. And they do that not only by all what I've mentioned up to now, but also the proxy groups like the Hezbollah and the Hamas. And now their attempted entrenchment also in Syria in order to attack Israel. Every single foothold that they get is then launched as a terror attack, a terror launching pad against Israel, against the West. It is really a zero-sum game, unfortunately, where every spot and every influence that they take over is then used as a launching base for malign activity against the West, against the United States, and against Israel. Now, I know that there's been a lot of focus on the nuclear issue, and of course there is justice in that, because the nuclear issue is seen as an existential threat. It's certainly seen as an existential threat by the state of Israel. And we relate to it in that way. You know, Israel has many challenges, but the aspect of a potential nuclear military capability in the hands of a regime like Iran is certainly an existential threat to Israel and the Western world. We must understand that the logic is different. You can't bank on checks and balances like you do with regular states. Due to the fact that they have such an extreme radical ideology, you cannot bank on anything. There are no guarantees. And when they have missile capability, then they'll launch missiles. And if they have, God forbid, nuclear capability, then we know where it will go. So that's why Israel was against the JCPOA from its birth. We said that the JCPOA, instead of blocking and preventing nuclear capability, is actually paving the way for Iran to have nuclear capability, because it's just the sunset clauses and all the different aspects just paved the way that in a certain amount of time, Iran would even have legitimacy in having a nuclear military capability. So we were against the JCPOA, and we said all the time, fix it or nix it. That means either cancel it completely or fix it thoroughly, systematically, so that it actually prevents Iran from having nuclear capability and not the opposite. We hope that the policies of especially the American administration today and the Western world, Europe, will understand this vision that you cannot go back to a JCPOA as it was. That would be a tremendous mistake. That again would just pave the way for Iran to have legitimacy for a nuclear program. What we have to do is completely revise and change the JCPOA or cancel it completely. So that's the direction that we're talking about in the policy that we try to influence. I can say that there are intimate discussions between the leadership of Israel and the leadership of the American administration about these issues, and Israel expresses its voice and its opinion loud and clear.
Yeah, and you made a good point about how the regime funds their proxies all throughout the world, and I would add to that. And I recently wrote wrote an op-ed in Newsmax talking about this. That Iran is in a de facto state of war. This is my personal opinion. In a de facto state of war with the United States and with Israel and with other countries as well. Through the terrorist proxies that they fund, and of course, we all know, us here talking, and I'm sure the audience, everyone knows who Hamas is. They know who Hezbollah is. They know who the Houthis are. But there are so many more small groups that no one has ever heard of that, unfortunately, are inflicting an enormous amount of damage on people, and they don't care. These terrorist organizations, they don't really discriminate. They just want to kill. And unfortunately, that's who the regime funds. So,
of course, if I can just relate to that briefly,
please.
I'd just like to say that unfortunately, there are some regimes, even European regimes and others, who believe that you can tame the lion, and they're so mistaken. They believe that if they behave in a certain way, then the threat of Iran is not a threat for them, and that's a very false way at looking at these events. One has to look at it clearly, just like Morton said before, that you must take rhetoric seriously. We've learned from the past that if anybody threatens, you should believe what they're saying. But Iran is not only threatening, it's not only rhetoric. They're actually practicing what they preach, and they're going out and supporting these proxy groups, which are actually delivering terrorism. They're actually delivering malign activity around the world. So it's not even theoretical. It's not even theoretical rhetoric. Like, you could look at Nazi Germany in the 30s and you could say, oh, well, it's just rhetoric. With Iran, it's already reached the practice. And so we should all open our eyes and understand you cannot tame such a lion. You cannot come to terms with such a lion. You must make sure that the lion is not a lion anymore. And the only way to do that is with extreme pressure and sanctions, and making sure that the regime comes to the decision that they must change their policy or go. If the survival of the regime is standing on the brink, then that's perhaps the only thing that will make them change their policy.
And to that point, we're all aware of the very large economic sanctions that the prior president had put on the regime. And I think the IMF reported at one point that the Iranian regime's international funds, international reserves, at the beginning of President Trump's administration were in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And in the last couple months of President Trump's administration during his term, the IMF reported that Iran was down to $4 billion. Now, while $4 billion, of course, sounds like a lot of money to all of us, to a sovereign nation like Iran, $4 billion, they could burn through that in 2 months. So they were very much, to your point, on the brink. You know, it's no secret that our organization, IAL, certainly advocates for strong sanctions and strong maximum pressure against this regime, because we think that that's the only thing that this regime understands. They don't understand weakness. They, when you deal with bullies with weakness, unfortunately, it's not going to be a good result. You have to deal with bullies from a position of strength. That's the only thing that they support or understand. Go ahead, Morton.
I'll just add to that, if I may, that,
Please.
you know, the belief was that the JCPO will also moderate Iran, bring Iran into the family or the community, and they'll have interests, and due to these interests, they will moderate. Of course, that was proven a total false misconception, because the more strength that they got, the more they were empowered, the more they used that empowerment and that strength and that cash for empowering the terrorist organizations and their malign activity. So this whole line of moderating Iran through diplomatic deals is already been proven false many times in the past. One must understand who you're dealing with and deal with it strong, with conviction, as one would say.
Winston, can you hear me? Winston Churchill had a famous line, I think, that applies here. He said, "Those who appease the crocodile will simply be eaten last." Appeasing Iran will not work. It may delay it temporarily, but we have to confront them directly and know who they are and what their goal is. And they will not stop until they achieve that goal, or until the Western world stops them.
Yeah, Mort, thanks for adding some commentary on that. So I want to shift to our last theme of the night, and that's talking about the future. For this part, I'm going to ask the both of you to please offer your commentary on this. Consul General, we'll start with you. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I think any freedom, peace-loving individual in this country certainly, you know, hopes for the day, the future, you know, when there will be true peace in the Middle East. You know, as a lot of us know, you know, peace has really been taking root in different forms in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. In Saudi Arabia, they're scrubbing textbooks of anti-Israel rhetoric. In Morocco, they're mandating Jewish studies into their country's curriculum. And in the UAE, Israel recently opened a consulate on the diplomatic front. And private sector businesses it's gangbusters. I have friends that are in this world, and they send me updates every week about the different deals that are happening between Israelis and Emiratis. It's beautiful. So, you know, these relationships they're really growing in a very fast way. In addition, Israelis can now fly nonstop to many Gulf countries in the region and vice versa. Arabs can now fly to Israel. You know, so one thing is for sure, from my perspective, is that I think the Abraham Accords are certainly having a direct impact on the diplomatic, economic, and societal fronts between Israel and these Gulf states. So with that said, the Islamic Republic of Iran continues to take aim at Israel. They continue to take aim at anyone that would even think about normalizing relations with Israel. So the question is this, and Consul General, we'll start with you. You know, do you think the day will ever come when Israel and Iran are able to establish diplomatic relations?
Yes, I'll respond to that quickly, and then I'll go over to the Abraham Accords. I'll just say that yes, I believe that the day will come. It requires a dramatic change in Iran. It requires us to maintain a strong policy. But I think that the day will come. You know, the vector is positive. As I said before, if you look at the vector, you know, when Israel was established, 0 Arab countries recognized Israel. And today we have Egypt and Jordan and the Abraham Accords, which added another 4 countries. And we have countries in the Muslim bloc that have understandings and deep cooperation with Israel, even if it's not public. So the vector is positive, and Iran one day, I believe that the people of Iran will be victorious. If the people of Iran will be victorious of their own regime, and the people will have their will, then I think that we will have peace. In that aspect, it's similar also to the Palestinian issue. But I think that the day will come because this regime will have to either change its policy or fall one day. We see what's going on. We just look at the news. What's going on in Iran today? The poverty, the human rights aspect. There's a very big difficulty of the people to overthrow the regime because the military forces are totally loyal to the regime and not to the people. If you look at the different countries in the Arab Spring, for instance, Egypt fell. Mubarak fell, but other countries did not fall. What was the big difference? The big difference was, where are the military forces? Are the military forces loyal to the people, or are they loyal to the regime? And the problem is that in Iran, you have the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is loyal to the regime, doesn't care about the people. They have their interests, economic interests, and other interests, and therefore they're loyal to the regime. But someday this will have to fall apart because there are people there, and the majority of the people are not supporting this policy. If I just relate now to the Abraham Accords, this shows how the direction of the world is towards more cooperation, more understanding. The Arab states even understand today that Israel is not an enemy but an ally. They understand the benefits that they can get from Israel. And they also see the alliance between themselves and Israel against Iran, because they feel the threat from Iran sometimes even more so than what Israel feels. So there's a strong alliance and a growing alliance of understanding, cooperation, collaboration between Israel and the Arab and Muslim world, which in the end is isolating Iran more and more. And therefore, my belief, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I believe that one day things will change in Iran. And the real peace with Iran will only come depending on two things. One, that Iran changes its policy completely or the regime falls. And the other aspect that is important is our policy. What policy we undertake towards Iran. In that aspect, I go back to what was said before, that against appeasement and against going back to the JCPOA as it was, we must stand strong and confront Iran, and that's the only way we will bring about one of the positive changes, either a changing of the policy or a falling of the regime.
Thank you very much, Mort.
I have a couple things to say. One, I really agree with President Sisi of Egypt that to get real peace between most of the Muslim world, most of the Arab Muslim countries in Israel, you need a revolution in Islam. Sisi said this to Al-Aqsa University leaders. There has to be a revolution. They have to stop believing that Jews are the enemy, that this is their holy land and they will not accept Israel because they're on their holy land. The Arab Islamic world understands if they make peace with Israel, it's beneficial to them politically, economically, but it's unfortunately a large aspect of this is a religious war. Islam says Jews cannot have sovereignty on their area, and Islam also preaches enormous enmity toward Jews and says horrific things about Jews in the Quran. So I think you really need a revolution of imams and leading imams, especially from Al-Aqsa University in Cairo, the Harvard of the Muslim academic world, before you'll have real peace. And I wanted to ask Dr. Newman, who, by the way, I think Israel is so fortunate to have someone so eloquent, so articulate, so knowledgeable, so passionate to present Israel's case. Israel's very, very lucky. It's a shame you can't be in all the major cities.
Thank you.
But I wanted to ask him, the peace we have with these countries, certainly Egypt and Jordan are very cold. They're a very cold peace. We don't have real business relationships. We don't have relationships between teachers and scientists and doctors and lawyers in Israel, and the same in Jordan and Egypt. It's not allowed. So I'm not really thrilled with the peace. A cold peace is better than a hot war, but I'm still not thrilled. And I'm concerned, Doctor, if in fact this Iran issue is resolved, And then UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and others will no longer have this fear of Iran. Do you think it's possible that these Arab countries will then revert back to norm and no longer have the positive relationships that are developing right now?
Thank you for the question. I think I have a clear view on that, and I think that there's more than just the fear of Iran that brings us together. And therefore, even if we do come to there's a day that we have peace with Iran, which is of course not tomorrow morning, I don't think it will change anything in our relationship between UAE and Bahrain and countries like that, because the glue that brings us together is much deeper and much wider than just the animosity towards Iran or the fear of Iran. It's the benefit that they feel that they can get from Israel. It's the understanding that we're a friend, we're an ally and not an enemy. It's the innovation that we can do together. It's the feeling that these countries are now caring more for the benefit of their society and their population. And they understand that Israel in that is of benefit and an asset for them. And therefore, it's much deeper than just the fear of Iran. Now, I'd like to add one thing about the Abraham Accords, as you mentioned, more very rightfully so. The Abraham Accords have brought a warmth to the peace that we didn't have with Egypt and Jordan. The Egypt and Jordan Accords was more like a ceasefire, which never trickled down to the people. It wasn't on a popular level. It was just a piece of paper between governments, and it remained on government level, but it doesn't trickle down to the people. But the peace with UAE and Bahrain, if you follow the social media and you follow the expressions of the people, it's totally different. It's a people-to-people peace, really. I mean, it's signed on papers between governments, but it's a totally different situation. It's a warm peace. And that's what makes it so different. It's a breaking of the taboo in a different fashion completely to the kind of ceasefire agreements between Egypt and Jordan. Let me finish with one story. You know, there was an Arab singer who met with an Israeli singer, Omer Adam, and they had a photograph taken. And when an Egyptian singer met with Omer Adam, they had a photograph taken. And when he went back to Egypt, he was criticized, and they wanted to send him out of the Artists Union of Egypt because he dared to take a photo with an Israeli. And he then started to try and apologize in an apologetic manner, saying that he didn't know who was in the photo. He didn't know it was an Israeli. This photo was taken in UAE, United Arab Emirates, where Omer Adam was invited to give public performances, public knowledge performances in the Sheikh's palace. So just look at the gap here, what we're talking about. And in Egypt, they still have to criticize a singer for taking a photograph with an Israeli, whereas this Israeli is invited to give public performances in UAE. We're talking about a totally different cultural environment of peace.
Well, Dr. Newman, why do you think UAE and Bahrain, I think I'm correct when I say this, felt compelled to criticize Israel in the Hamas war against Israel, when Israel was simply retaliating, trying to defend itself and stop their missiles? No Hamas missiles, no Israeli retaliation. Why do you think UAE and Bahrain felt compelled to criticize Israel publicly?
Well, I think that they do have concerns like the Arab Street, and they do have concerns like repercussions, attacks by radical Islam. You know why it took so long for UAE and other countries to come forward? It's not that they doubted that Israel is a friend. They were afraid of the repercussions of what would happen. What would happen if, let's say, Iran would attack them, attack their tankers or their oil fields? That's billions of dollars of interest that could be affected just by taking the step of making peace with Israel. But they did gather the courage and they went forward and they did it. So one should also, I think one shouldn't always look at the half empty glass, but we should also look at the half full glass. And the half full glass is the fact that they didn't reverse their relations with Israel. I mean, the attack by Hamas on Israel with the launching of rockets and the street riots by the Arabs, one of their main motivations was to try and reverse the peace of the Abraham Accords. That was a bone in their throat. And they thought that if they raised the issue of Al-Aqsa Mosque under threat, you know, all these falsifications, Palestinians evicted from their homes. They drew out all the misconceptions and falsifications that they could in order to try and derail the peace. And not one of the Arab states that moved forward on the Abraham Accords reversed the decision or changed the policy. So we should look at that.
And I would also add to that, and Dr. Newman, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do recall seeing the UAE put out a statement when Hamas was attacking Israel, not as strong as maybe a lot of us would have liked, but they very sharply criticized Hamas. Am I correct in that?
Yes, they came out with statements in both directions, and we understand the sensitivities and we understand their needs. As long as the policy is steadfast, we're happy.
Sure. So, we've talked about the past, the present, and the future, and it's been an enlightening conversation that we've had thus far. And we're getting to the end of our program here, but Dr. Newman, I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide some brief closing remarks before I wrap us up here.
Thank you, Bryan. Okay, just a few brief remarks. First of all, again, I just want to, if there's any message that I'd like to come out of this webinar or this debate or discussion, I'd like that the people of Iran understand that Israel cares for them. We understand that they've been taken hostage by a rogue regime that doesn't care for their interests. And you see what's going on in the streets and the basic commodities that are in need. And we feel for the people of Iran. We see the people of Iran as friends, potential allies, and we hope to re-engage like we had historical good relations in the past, to go back to that. We admire the Persian culture. We admire the Persian people, and we'd like to renew the good old days. I'd like to, as I said before, we extended our hand in peace and friendship with the entire Arab and Muslim world, and we do that even with Iran. We never defined Iran as an enemy. It was them that changed their policy overnight and defined Israel as their enemy. We're not looking for a fight or hostility with any country, and we call on the Iranian regime to change their policy completely, see in Israel an ally and an asset of benefit for them, for themselves, and for their people. And if not, if they cannot change their policy, then go away for the good of the people of Iran. Let the people of Iran decide, because if the people of Iran had the decision, then the current regime would not be intact. And lastly, I'd like to say that I admire your courage as the Iranian Americans that speak out against the regime, clearly stating the situation. I know that there's even, you need courage for that. There's even a threat. I mean, we've seen about different Iranian attempts to hijack, kidnap people. I don't want to mention names, but we know of a woman in the United Kingdom and others who were under threat of being kidnapped just because they spoke out against the regime. So we must understand what type of a regime we're talking about, where human rights doesn't exist really, and they go out to kidnap just because people criticize the regime. So we also admire your courage as Iranian Americans to speak out for liberty and for rights of the people of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, to your point, there certainly has been the very high profile case that we've all seen recently that Mort talked about with 4 Iranian operatives being charged. But this happens every day. Little things like, we've had some of our board members on, unfortunately, what seems like a monthly basis, they're getting notifications that people are trying to access their email account. So it's little non-evasive things like that. And then there's a lot more serious things where, we've heard horrible stories of Iranian Americans being followed around, videotaped, and assaulted. This regime, they will do whatever they can and whatever they deem to be necessary to silence the voices of not just Iranians within their own country, but Iranian dissidents in America and all throughout the world. So it's truly something that we all need to raise our voices about. And with that said, tonight's conversation really has been remarkable. And I think that this is one of the first times that a Jewish American and a Iranian American group have come together, to host a senior official of the state of Israel. And as I mentioned when we first started, in a way, tonight we're building our own bridges, as there are Iranians that are in Israel right now building bridges. We're also doing some as well. So it's been nice. But before we wrap up, I'd like to just briefly share with the audience that the last round of attacks between Israel and the Iranian-backed Hamas, there were many non-Jewish Iranian Americans who raised their voices on social media. Our board president, Dr. Daniel Jafari, did an interview with the Jewish outlet talking about this, condemning this, it's a lot of people don't understand that non-Jewish Iranian Americans are just as supportive of the Jewish people in the state of Israel as Jewish Iranian Americans are. So, there's widespread support for the state of Israel, the Israeli people, and the Jewish people. And I, for one, really look forward to the day, where I can visit Iran, eat some kebabs on the streets without having, to fear for my life. And I know that there's a lot of Jewish Americans, Israeli Americans, Iranian Americans that feel the same way. So, in closing, let me just say thank you to our audience and everyone for being here tonight. And I want to give a special thank you, Toda Rabbah, to the both of you, Consul General Newman, ZOA's National President, Morton Klein. It's been truly an honor to moderate this conversation with you. And thank you to the both of you for joining us. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you so much.